Music. Arnold Schwarzenegger is not just a legend. He is living proof that greatness can be carved out of pain, discipline, and an unshakable vision. He was not born into privilege, but into suffering and darkness. And yet he rose like a storm, forging his body into discipline, his will into steel, and his destiny into history. From the global stages of Mr. Olympia to the halls of power, from the unrelenting fury of the Terminator to the quiet poise of a statesman, Arnold has carried the weight of the world on his shoulders and never once let it fall. He didn't just change the game. He rewrote the definition of strength, of courage, of defying every voice that ever said, "You can't." For decades, he stood firm as a symbol of control, precision, and resilience in the face of pain. And today, with a personal fortune exceeding $1.2 billion, with fame reaching heights the world can only gaze up at, the cruel irony is this: no glory, no wealth can hold back the silent storm that is closing in. Because even the greatest hero must one day stumble. And now, as the curtain of age grows heavier, a brutal storm is rolling in. One that no spotlight can conceal and no muscle can withstand. At 78, Arnold is no longer fighting for titles or applause. He is facing a chapter more challenging than any role he has ever played. Before we begin, don't forget to hit like as a gesture of strength and respect for this extraordinary legend. But storms are not new to Arnold Schwarzenegger. Long before the cameras, the championships, and the billion-dollar fortune, there was a boy. A boy who knew the taste of cold floors, the sound of silence, and the weight of being unseen. Born on July 30, 1947 in the small Austrian village of Thal, Arnold came into a world still marked by the shadows of war. Austria was rebuilding, but the scars lingered in its streets, in its homes, and in the hearts of its people. His family lived in a modest house without modern comforts, where winters were bitter and warmth was something earned, not given. His father, Gustav, a police officer shaped by a difficult past, ruled the household with stern discipline. Praise was rare, affection rarer still. Arnold would later recall that he feared not punishment, but invisibility, the quiet ache of feeling overlooked in his own home. The golden child was his older brother, Minhard, who seemed to effortlessly command their father's approval. Arnold, by contrast, was the quiet one, watchful, determined, yet rarely noticed. This imbalance planted in him a fierce hunger to prove his worth. "I knew love wasn't handed out in our house," he would say years later. "You had to earn it, and even then, you might not get it." That realization hardened his resolve. He decided that if no one was going to lift him up, he would lift himself literally. The problem was, there was no gym in Thal, no shiny equipment, no mentor to guide him. What he had were scraps of metal, pieces of wood, and a cold cellar that smelled of earth and rust. In that dim space, lit by a single bulb, Arnold began shaping more than just muscle. Every improvised weight he lifted was a silent declaration. "I am here. I matter." The clang of metal became his answer to the silence upstairs. While other boys played outside or idled away summer afternoons, Arnold was underground. Sweat dripping onto the concrete, picturing a life far beyond the borders of his village. On his bedroom walls, he taped magazine cutouts of bodybuilders, titans, who, to him, weren't just strong, but free. Free from smallness, from shame, from being unseen. He studied their poses as if they were sacred texts, memorizing the shapes and lines of the human form. Not for vanity, but for escape. Strength, he would later reflect, wasn't about looking powerful. It was about surviving. In those years, survival meant building a body and a will so formidable that nothing, not poverty, not isolation, not doubt, could hold him back. By his early teens in the late 1950s, Arnold's world began to widen. He discovered a small gym in Graz several miles away and would bike for hours just to train there. The journey was grueling. Uphill rides and biting wind, returning home long after dark. But he relished the challenge. Each pedal stroke was a step away from the life he didn't want and a step closer to the life he imagined. His friends thought he was obsessed. They were right. Arnold wasn't chasing a hobby. He was chasing freedom. In later interviews, he would speak of that time without bitterness, but with clarity. "I never saw a future in that village," he said. "I had to create one." And so, in the crucible of a cold Austrian cellar, and on the roads that led to Graz, a champion was forged. Not by applause, not by comfort, but by the quiet rebellion of a boy who refused to stay small. Those early years, hard and unrelenting, gave him more than muscle. They gave him the discipline, the vision, and the unshakable belief that he could outwork any obstacle. Long before the world knew his name, Arnold Schwarzenegger was already building the one thing that would define him forever: the strength to rise again and again, no matter how heavy the weight. When Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped off the plane in 1968 at just 21 years old, America was not the golden land of opportunity he had imagined. It was a battlefield he would have to cross alone. He arrived with a suitcase of clothes, a handful of dollars, and a dream too heavy for the thin wallet in his pocket. His Austrian accent wrapped around every word like chains, turning simple conversations into exhausting marathons. People smiled politely when he spoke, but many simply couldn't understand him. "I didn't know the words," Arnold would later recall. "So I spoke with my actions. Those actions meant work. Hard, unglamorous, bone-deep work." By day, he hauled bricks and swung hammers on construction sites under the California sun, muscles burning as he saved every dollar. By night, he trained in cramped, dimly lit gyms that smelled of iron and ambition, sculpting a body he was certain the world could not ignore. He rented small shared rooms, just a bed, a flickering lamp, and a place to hang his dream. Some nights, he would lie awake, staring at a cracked ceiling, listening to the hum of Los Angeles traffic, and wonder if he had made the greatest mistake of his life. In those years, bodybuilding in America was still a niche obsession, far from the celebrated sport it would later become. Outside a tight circle of devotees, most saw it as a strange sideshow. To them, Arnold was just another over-muscled foreigner chasing an impossible fantasy. He knew there was only one way to change their minds: win and keep winning until they could no longer dismiss him. In 1970, at just 23, he became the youngest man ever to win Mr. Olympia, but each title came with suffocating pressure. "If I lost," he said, "I wasn't just losing a trophy, I was losing my place in this country." Every contest was a fight for survival, for identity, for the right to stay. The loneliness was sharper than the physical strain. Thousands of miles from Thal, Austria, he longed for his mother's cooking, the familiar hills of his hometown, even the stern voice of his father. But there were no arms to fall into here, no family to share the weight. America was loud, fast, and unyielding. His closest companions were in the gym, men who understood the language of pain and progress. Yet, when the weights stopped clanging and the lights went out, the silence returned. His body, too, exacted a price. In his relentless drive to grow stronger, he pushed past limits until they pushed back. Torn muscles, aching joints, deep bruises. They were not badges of glory, but warnings. Still, he pressed on. Pain became his currency, traded daily for a shot at the future he envisioned. He wrapped his knees, iced his elbows, and lifted anyway. The bridge back to Austria had been burned. The moment he left, there was no retreat. Through it all, he clung to a singular vision. A day when no one could overlook him, when his name would be etched not only into bodybuilding history, but into the culture itself. Every bead of sweat, every dollar saved, every night spent alone was a brick in the monument he was building to himself. Looking back decades later, he said, "I saw myself where I wanted to be, not where I was." That unshakable vision and the pain he accepted as its price turned a stranger in a strange land into a man the whole world would one day know. By the early 1970s, Arnold Schwarzenegger was no longer the outsider sleeping in a cramped room. He was the face of a sport. In 1970, at just 23, he claimed his first Mr. Olympia title, and by 1975, he had already stood atop the podium 6 times. The 7th would come in 1980, sealing his place as a legend. But behind the dazzling trophies was a truth few could see. Each victory brought not relief but a heavier burden. The pressure to maintain a body sculpted to near mythical proportions meant training through pain, hiding injuries, and living on a razor's edge between triumph and breakdown. Torn tendons, aching joints, and the constant fear that one wrong move could end it all haunted him like shadows under the spotlight. Winning makes you a target, he would say years later. Everyone watches, waiting for the day you slip. Hollywood soon came calling. And in 1982, Conan the Barbarian turned him from a sports icon into a rising movie star. Yet even here, the climb was uphill. Studio executives laughed at his thick accent, called his name too long, too foreign, too impossible for a marquee. Roles were scarce, and rejection was constant. But Arnold, forged in the grind of bodybuilding, refused to yield. He studied acting, worked on his delivery, and when 1984's The Terminator hit theaters, the same accent they once mocked became a cinematic trademark. His line, "I'll be back," echoed around the world. Fame, however, has its own price. The schedules were merciless. Months spent on location far from home, from family, from anything familiar. The distance carved quiet spaces in his life that no applause could fill. He had wealth, influence, and recognition beyond his wildest dreams. Yet some nights, alone in hotel rooms, he felt the same silence he had known as a young man in Los Angeles. And fame made every stumble louder. A movie that underperformed, a competition not won, even a personal misstep. Each one magnified because he wasn't just Arnold. He was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Success had built him a throne, but it also made him a prisoner of expectation. The same spotlight that lit his path could just as easily expose his flaws. Then came the transitions that would test him in ways neither iron nor cameras ever had. Retiring from competition to focus solely on acting, leaving behind the certainty of movie stardom to enter the unpredictable arena of politics in the early 2000s. Each move drew critics who questioned his motives, his abilities, his right to even try. Every choice carried the risk of erasing the image he had spent decades building. Yet he embraced the risk, knowing that stagnation was a quieter kind of death. If you don't keep moving forward, he once said, you start moving backward. From the outside, it was all glory. The 7 Olympia crowns, the box office triumphs, the governorship. But those who looked closer could see the truth. At the peak, the air is thin, the nights are long, and the man on top is still in many ways alone. He had built his empire with iron, discipline, and a will sharp enough to carve through the impossible. For decades, Arnold Schwarzenegger's body was his fortress, unshakable under the lights of Mr. Olympia, unyielding beneath the crushing schedules of Hollywood, unbreakable in the ruthless theater of politics. It had carried him across continents into history books and through storms that would have swallowed lesser men whole. But in 1997, at 50 years old, that fortress cracked. Fluorescent lights burned above him. The sterile cold bite of antiseptic filled his lungs. Somewhere in the distance, a heart monitor pulsed out a rhythm that was no longer entirely his own. On that hospital bed in Los Angeles, he was not the Terminator, not the governor-to-be. Not the 7-time Mr. Olympia, whose body had been a living monument to human will. He was a man stripped to his most fragile truth, about to let surgeons cut into his chest to replace an aortic valve he'd been born with and kept hidden for half a century. It wasn't pride that had kept him silent. It was fear. Fear that the world would see what he had spent a lifetime outrunning, that even the strongest man in the room could be vulnerable. He didn't tell his mother back in Austria. She was aging, her hands already touched by time, and he refused to place another weight upon her shoulders. I'll call her when it's over, he told himself. But in 1999 she was gone. No call, no goodbye. He was on set when the news came, the cameras rolling, muscles carved from decades of war with gravity. While inside the sun in him splintered into pieces, the scar on his chest would fade. The scar in his heart would never close. And so he did what he had always done. He kept moving. Through the 2000s, there were film premieres where flashbulbs exploded like artillery. Political rallies where the crowd roared his name, speeches that echoed through grand halls. The machine to the world still looked flawless. But in the quiet moments when the lights went down and the doors closed, his heart would whisper. He knew it would come again. In March 2018, at 70 years old, it did. What should have been a routine catheter valve replacement unraveled without warning into an emergency open heart surgery. "We made a mistake," the surgeons told him when he woke, confused, restrained, unable to speak through the tube in his throat. For a man whose entire life had been built on control, this was a private hell. Flashes of thought cut through the fog like lightning. His children. Will they remember me as strong? Or will they remember this, Maria? Does she still care? The press. What will they write? And always the image of his mother gone without a goodbye, haunting him with the fear that he might leave his own children with the same wound. October 2020, 72, surgery number 3. By then, he no longer asked, "Why me?" There was no bargaining left, no denial, just a nod to the doctors. An unspoken acknowledgement that resistance was a useless weapon against time. Then came March 2024, 76 years old, still lifting weights, still smiling for cameras, still speaking to crowds that hung on his every word. But deep inside, the rhythm that had carried him through every battle began to stumble, arrhythmia. The doctor said scar tissue from decades of surgeries was scrambling the electrical signals of his heart. The solution? A pacemaker. For most, a lifeline. For Arnold, it felt like a verdict. The man who had once bent steel with his bare hands, who had crushed records and stood alone at the summit of two worlds, would now live because a device told his heart when to beat. He looked at the doctor and whispered almost to himself, "I used to be the machine. Now I need one inside me." Days later, he went public through his podcast, Arnold's Pump Club. On the surface, it was about raising awareness, telling the world that even giants can fall. But those who listened closely could hear something heavier than words. The fatigue of a warrior who has counted too many scars to remember, and the quiet surrender that comes when you have fought every battle and know there are more ahead. Less than a week after surgery, he stood at an environmental summit. Lights flashed like 1,000 tiny suns. Applause thundered like distant surf. He smiled, the same smile that had charmed millions for decades. But beneath the tailored suit was a fresh line of stitches, a hidden pacemaker, and a man who now measured every handshake, every sunrise, every speech against the relentless ticking inside his chest. He had built a life on proving he was stronger than pain, stronger than doubt, stronger than failure itself. Now each morning his first act was to press his palm to his chest. Not to test the hardness of muscle, but to feel the quiet mechanical pulse that kept him here. Not because he had conquered death, but because he had finally learned to hear it. This is the new Arnold. Not the unbreakable icon, not the invincible machine, just a man with scars. Some carved into flesh, others buried where no one can see. Still pushing forward, even as the silence follows just one step behind. Sometimes the pain that cuts the deepest doesn't come from a surgeon's scalpel or the terror of a failing heartbeat. It comes from the slow, silent theft of a loved one's mind, from watching the person you once knew slip away while their body still stands before you. The world called Arnold Schwarzenegger a titan of strength, a force carved from iron and willpower. A man who had lifted himself from cold gym floors to the highest podiums of power. But there was no weight he could lift to stop the moment he looked into his father's eyes and realized the man he loved was already gone. It began years earlier in the early 2000s when Sergeant Shriver, the proud American diplomat, co-founder of the Peace Corps, husband to Eunice Kennedy Shriver, and the man who had shaped Arnold's moral compass and political dreams, started showing small cracks in the armor. At first, they were almost harmless, forgotten keys. A repeated story told as if it were new. A name skipped over in the middle of a sentence. Arnold noticed, and his chest tightened because he had seen these signs before. An uncle in Austria who had faded into dementia the same way. He knew what was coming, and it was worse than any physical injury he had ever faced. As the months turned into years, the erosion quickened. The man who had once stood before presidents, spoken to nations, and inspired millions was now a fragile figure moving through rooms like a ghost in his own life. Then came the day that would carve a scar in Arnold's memory forever. It was a quiet afternoon visit. The sun fell in soft light across the room. Arnold leaned in to speak, expecting a smile, a spark of recognition. Instead, Sargent looked at him with a gaze that was neither confused nor frustrated, only vacant. "Who are you?" he asked, the words falling with the weight of 1,000 heartbreaks. Arnold's throat closed. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because in that instant his father, the man who had taught him how to knot a tie, how to speak with dignity, how to believe that public service could be a noble calling, was gone, not dead, gone. And there is no grief sharper, no wound more bitter than mourning someone who is still alive. Arnold would later admit in rare moments of vulnerability that this cut deeper than any of his surgeries. Deeper than heartbreak, deeper even than his most public failures, because it forced him to face a truth that haunted him long after the funeral. What if one day I forget who I am too? Watching Sargent fade wasn't just emotional agony. It was a cruel mirror. Every misplaced word, every lost moment, every blank stare became a whisper in Arnold's mind that neither muscle nor money nor medals could guard him from the slow, merciless erosion of memory. It haunted him in hotel rooms after speeches, in the silence between film takes, in the stillness of dawn before the world knew he was awake. In interviews, he kept his composure, saying all the right things, praising his father's legacy, talking about hope, promising to fight for awareness. But behind closed doors, his fear became a discipline. He overhauled his diet, added supplements, devoured research, began daily mental exercises not to live longer, but to remember longer. Because it wasn't death that terrified him, it was the thought of disappearing while still breathing. As the disease stole more of Sargent, Arnold's own reflection began to shift. He started to see time not as a mountain to conquer, but as a force to negotiate with. A rival you couldn't defeat, only delay. His workouts became less about sculpting bulk and more about building longevity. His speeches turned from ambition toward legacy, each word chosen as if it might be the last the world remembered him by. When Sargent passed in 2011, Arnold stood at the podium to deliver the eulogy. He was not the movie star, not the former governor, not the icon the cameras adored. He was a son, broken, grieving, and afraid. The cameras captured the public moment, the measured words, the strength in his voice. But they did not capture the private moment afterward. When Arnold sat alone in the back of the hall, staring at the empty chair where his father had once sat, tall and proud, he whispered something into the stillness too low for anyone to hear. Maybe it was a promise. Maybe it was a prayer that he would not let the same silent thief take him without a fight. That when his own time came, the world would remember him before it forgot his name. He had endured the silent agony of watching someone he loved fade into the shadows of memory. But nothing in that long history of heartbreak could prepare him for the storm he would bring upon himself. A storm born not of fate but of his own choices. This was not an accident. It was the single mistake that would shatter the image he had built over decades, tear apart the trust of the people who mattered most, and leave a scar that no time or triumph could erase. For years, Arnold Schwarzenegger carried the crushing weight of a truth he could never speak aloud. He had fathered a child with Mildred Bayana, the family's longtime housekeeper, a woman who had been part of their home for over 20 years, trusted in the smallest moments of their daily lives. In 1997, Mildred gave birth to Joseph, Arnold's son. At almost the same time, Maria Shriver, his wife of more than a decade, gave birth to their youngest, Christopher. Two boys born within weeks of each other, growing up under the same roof. One openly acknowledged, the other hidden in plain sight. For over a decade, the secret lived within the walls of their home like a shadow that refused to leave. As Joseph grew, the resemblance to Arnold became harder to ignore. The broad shoulders, the posture, the unmistakable spark in his eyes. Maria noticed the similarities more than once, but love and trust blinded her to what her heart did not want to believe. She had stood beside Arnold through every reinvention, the relentless grind of bodybuilding, the scrutiny of Hollywood, the ruthless battles of political life, sacrificing her own career and privacy to raise 4 children under an unforgiving spotlight. She had been his partner in every war, but there was a war she didn't know she was fighting. And the enemy was already inside the gates. In 2011, the truth could no longer hide. Maria confronted Mildred, and the answer she received broke her world open. Arnold confessed without resistance, the words tumbling like stones that had been lodged in his chest for years. There were no elaborate explanations, no desperate lies, only the raw admission of a betrayal he could never undo. For Maria, it was more than infidelity. It was a deep fracture of trust, a public humiliation, and the realization that the life she had defended so fiercely was not what she thought it was. Quietly, she moved out of their home. Within days, the press got the story and the world descended. Headlines screamed. Commentators dissected every detail. Strangers judged. But beneath the noise was the real devastation. 4 children, Catherine, Christina, Patrick, and Christopher, blindsided by the news. And a teenage boy, Joseph, suddenly thrust from the shadows into a storm of judgment he had never asked for. Arnold, now stripped of control, did what little he could. He acknowledged Joseph publicly, offered support, and tried to build a relationship. But even as the boy accepted his place in Tide, Arnold's life, the years of silence had already left their mark. Maria's rare public statement carried a grace that stunned many. This is painful and heartbreaking, but it is also part of life. In those words was the quiet dignity of a woman deeply wounded but unwilling to let bitterness define her. For Arnold, the shame was suffocating. This was not a scandal in his eyes. It was the moment he ceased to be the man his wife could lean on, the man his children could fully trust. He had built an empire on discipline, charm, and precision control. But this mistake stripped all of that away, revealing a truth far more uncomfortable than failure. That even he could destroy the very thing he cherished most. The fallout cut deeper than career or reputation. It was spiritual, shaking the foundation of who he believed he was. Years later, in an interview, he would say with unflinching honesty, "There's no one else to blame. I caused this. I hurt the person I loved most, and I'll carry that shame for the rest of my life." And he meant it, because behind the muscles, the films, the speeches, and the accolades stood a man who could never unsee the pain in Maria's eyes. Never forget the moment trust died. Never fully bridge the distance in his children's hearts. No Hollywood redemption arc could rewrite this chapter. Some mistakes do not vanish. They live with you quietly, relentlessly every single day. He did not stand before cameras to plead for public forgiveness. Nor did he step on to talk, show stages to explain himself, or twist the truth into something easier to accept. Arnold Schwarzenegger chose silence, not as an escape but as a deliberate act of responsibility. A decision to bear the weight of his actions without spectacle. When the truth erupted in 2011 and shattered the foundation of his family, he stepped away from the glare of the spotlight, retreating not in fear, but in acknowledgement that some wounds cannot be healed with words alone.